Honourable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and to her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interests and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Please be seated. Hey.
Introduction of visitors. Introduction of guests.
Honourable members, we have very special guests visiting today of the Minister of Transportation, the CFO for Kids Cancer Care in Calgary, Deborah Owesai, and the founder of Kids Cancer Care, happens to also be the minister's wife, Christine McIver is here. Welcome. A very warm welcome to guests of the member of Athabasca Barhead Westlock, His Worship Colin Durko, Mayor of Boyle, Alberta, is here today with his daughter, Shayla Ellen. Thank you so much for joining us today. Also go ahead. Also visiting, the member of Peace River, welcome from Mackenzie County, Reeve Josh Canelson, CAO Len Racher, and Executive Assistant Carol Gabriel. And also in the galleries today are special guests for the member of Calgary Fish Creek. Welcome Brock Bakley and Emily Brand. And last but not least, honourable members, guests of the MLA for Bonnyville, Cold Lake, St. Paul, Kevin and Judy Hansen. Please rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly. Honourable members, the Honourable Member for Edmonton, Whitemud, has a statement to make.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While today is Budget Day, it is also my son's 7th birthday. So through you, Mr. Speaker, and because I promised him that I would do it, happy birthday, Bodie. I'm so proud to be your mama. I spend a lot of... He'll appreciate that. I spend a lot of time thinking about the world in which my kids are growing up, and there's no doubt that the budget today will have an impact on them. My son, who is in grade 1, and my daughter, who will be starting kindergarten this September, are entering an education system that is under attack by their own government. A system that the education minister is dragging backwards with an outdated approach to learning that focuses on standardized testing rather than fostering students' abilities to think critically. My kids will go to school in classes that are already getting crowded and will only keep getting more so since this government has cut funding to classrooms. And with the government's new funding model distributing money based on previous year's student numbers, funding will absolutely not keep up with the growth that we're going to see in our schools. Even my 7-year-old, Mr. Speaker, understands that if there are more kids getting a piece of the birthday cake, but the size of the cake stays the same, every kid gets a smaller piece. My son's understanding of math is already better than the Minister of Education's. I want my kids to fulfill their ambitions and follow their skills after completing high school, whether that means being a pipe fitter, a teacher, a chef, an artist, whichever path they choose after high school, trades, college, or university. It's all post-secondary. All are valuable, and all are being cut by this government. Supporting the trades requires more than creating a Hall of Fame or a nice story in the throne speech. It means putting your money where your mouth is. When I asked my son what he wanted for his birthday, he said he wanted ice cream to fall down from the sky like rain. It sounded pretty improbable, but no more improbable than the idea that this government will put aside its failed ideological experiments and do what's actually right for Albertans and our children in today's budget.
Yeah.
Honourable Member, I too would like ice cream to fall down from the sky, and a very happy birthday to Brody. The Honourable Member for Cardston Siksika has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Albertans have had enough. Illegal blockades that aim to cripple our economy must come to an end. Last Friday, the Prime Minister held a press conference where he called for the blockades to come down. Yet, nearly a week later, our rule of law is met with contempt. When will the Prime Minister actually listen to the Wet'suwet'en First Nations that want this Coastal GasLine and voted in favour of it? Canadians are fed up with being held hostage by urban green left zealots who have no connection or little connection to First Nations, let alone the Wet'suwet'en. First Nations don't want government handouts, and they certainly don't want self-righteous protesters acting and speaking on their behalf. Instead, they want jobs. They want industry, economic sustainability, and prosperity for their communities. They want the Coastal GasLink project. By standing idle, the Prime Minister put Canada's entire economy in jeopardy and has weakened all efforts for a meaningful reconciliation with First Nations people. True reconciliation is to listen to the Wet'suwet'en people, act against illegal blockades, and call for the acceleration of this project to help First Nation communities break the bonds of perennial poverty. Mr. Speaker, the federal government's failure to act and resolve this issue is an insult to the wishes of First Nations people, as well as hardworking men and women of our energy sector and transportation sectors who have been left stranded. There is no doubt that the blockades played a definitive role in the withdrawal of Tech Frontier's mine project, and Trudeau's continued weak leadership, emphasized weak, only discourages future investment in Alberta and Canada. It's time for the Prime Minister and the federal government to do what is right. It's time for the federal government to stand up for Albertans and all Canadians. It's time for these projects to move forward, and it's time for the wishes of these First Nation communities to be heard. Today, I stand in support of the overwhelming majority of the Wet'suwet'en people and the hardworking men and women of our energy sector who don't want to be held hostage anymore by these illegal blockades, now or in the future. Hear, 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 hear.
The honourable member for Sherwood Park.
Speaker, children receive a world-class education in Strathcona County, and the foundation of our educational success rests on school choice. Mr. Speaker, in Strathcona County, we have public, separate, francophone, charter, and homeschooling. Elk Island Public Schools serves approximately 18,000 students in 43 schools. Within our public system, there is great choice, including an alternative Christian program run by the Strathcona Christian Academy, or SCA group, which has an elementary school and a secondary school. Francis Poole is the principal at SCA Elementary. Jamie Peters is the assistant principal at SCA Elementary, and Mr. John Elsinga is the principal at SCA Secondary. Elk Island Catholic Schools has approximately 4,000 students in 18 schools. I have enjoyed attending Archbishop Jordan Catholic High School events, and I'm aware that ABJ, as it's known, has a world-class robotics program. Mr. Speaker, our charter school is New Horizons School, which is a K-9 school that enables academically gifted students to achieve excellence. Established in 1995, New Horizons is Alberta's oldest charter school. I had the honor of touring New Horizons School. École Claudette A. Denis Tardif is our Francophone school, which is K-6, and promotes excellence for their students while giving appropriate services to build a strong connection with the Francophone culture at home. The school opened in 2015 and today has more than 150 students. I enjoyed touring this school and attending a corn boil event there too last fall. Mr. Speaker, Strathcona County's education system serves as a great example of how school choice ensures excellence in education for Alberta's children. I am so proud to be part of a government that supports school choice. Thank you.
The honourable member for Edmonton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Tuesday, this government proudly proclaimed in a speech from the throne that the capital plan will be cut by $200 million. Conveniently, the previous capital plan was then immediately removed from the government's website to hide this cut. That $200 million cut could have paid for nearly 10 new K-9 schools and created hundreds of jobs within the trades and construction industry. Instead of investing in our communities and creating jobs for Albertans, they would rather continue their failed no-jobs corporate giveaway. While we wait for the upcoming budget, I would like to recap some of the infrastructure cuts that have hurt not only my constituents, but all Albertans. Terwilliger Drive here in Edmonton is a crucial roadway for constituents in my riding and as well as Edmonton Southwest. This government defunded the provincial portion of that freeway, and now there's going to be downloaded costs right on the city and its taxpayers. This government also recklessly chose to postpone the new hospital in South Edmonton until 2030. Edmonton has not received a new hospital since the Grey Nuns was opened in 1988. That's shameful. The Ministry of Infrastructure is also bringing back the failed P3 funding model. P3s have failed right across this country and right here in our communities. I've witnessed this failure firsthand from dangerous conditions at schools in my riding and across Edmonton. These cuts are harmful for Albertans. When will this government choose to stop cutting needed infrastructure projects to fund their $4.7 billion no-jobs handout and invest instead in crucial projects within our communities that will create jobs and which will actually get Albertans back to work?
The honourable member for Airdrie Cochrane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last several decades, personal and government debt around the world has escalated. In Canada, household debt exceeds $2.1 trillion, and personal savings rates are declining. It is reported that nearly half of Canadians are within $200 of being unable to pay their bills. Economic pressures felt in Alberta over the last 5 years have led to substantial job loss and increased insolvencies. Apathy towards debt has developed due to strong economic times and a long period of low interest rates. Governments continue to borrow heavily, regardless of economic conditions. Under the NDP, Alberta's debt increased by over $50 billion, and the Trudeau deficit now stands at $26.6 billion, with all of Canada's debt exceeding $1 trillion. Policies of sustained deficit financing will fail. We live in a time when we have watched countries go broke. Greece, Spain, Italy, Brazil, and Argentina have all had serious financial difficulties. In Venezuela, socialist policies caused financial collapse and moved the country into a period of hyperinflation. The region has become extremely volatile, plagued with civil unrest, starvation, and crime. Countries under debt restructuring lose autonomy. Decisions are made for them on social programs, pensions, and public sector funding, as finances are approved by foreign debt holders. If Canada were to experience a period of rising interest rates, our reliance on debt would place us in a vulnerable position. Mr. Speaker, it is imperative we get off the unsustainable spending trajectory that we are on. It is time we treat government money with more care and attention. This UCP government has a plan to balance by 2023. Once this is achieved, it will be essential to build surpluses, to pay back our debt, and secure Alberta's financial future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for St. Albert.
I think we can all agree that all of us in this chamber are paid fairly well. I also think most of us, likely not the millionaires in the room, would agree that a change to our pay schedule would entail some work for us, like reorganizing payment dates and other household budget adjustments. Now imagine you're one of the 127,000 disabled and low-income Albertans trying to get by on what Asian income support pays. For those of you that don't know, people on Asian income support live well below the poverty line. Disabled and low-income Albertans are struggling with these payment changes. This ridiculously short notice is adding to the confusion and harm. 2 nights ago, a disabled Albertan sent me a private message online and described a little bit of what life is like. It went like this. The rent is $1,000 per month, which thankfully includes electricity. Since this person doesn't live in an urban center, transportation costs are high. Add to that the cost of a cell phone, medical expenses, and this person is left with almost $250 for food and other expenses every month, if they're lucky. There's nothing left over. Food security becomes a problem. So because this person has already used the food bank more than their 3 times that they're eligible in 2019, they're now only able to get emergency baskets. Now think about our Premier's comments when he was asked about the decision to cut AISH by indexing. He said people wouldn't find it onerous. That is not true. We've heard from constituents, all of us. We all know they're struggling. Do the right thing. Tell your boss, this Premier, to re-index AISH and income support, then commit to consulting Albertans before you make changes that hurt them. Make Albertans more important than shareholders and profitable corporations.
The honourable member for Leduc Beaumont has a statement to make.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Education in Alberta is finally getting a new funding framework after 15 years. Inflation accounted for 55% of increased costs, while total spending increased by 80%, with student outcomes generally remaining the same. By cutting red tape and capping administration spending, the new formula will be putting funding back into the classroom. Under this new formula, school boards will have more flexibility and predictability when it comes to their annual funding. This upcoming school year, they will all be receiving a funding increase. We continue to meet our campaign commitment of maintaining or increasing K-12 education funding. By instituting a framework focused on yearly enrollment totals, many schools which were losing students to transfers or new schools were left with the potential of losing portions of their funding. Changing to a 3-year weighted moving average allows this funding model to assign value to enrollment from recent years into funding considerations. This will ensure that school boards minimize the need for mid-year funding requests. In rural schools, there is a potential for high turnover. Resources can be scarce. This is why the 3-year weighted enrollment will benefit rural schools, ensuring foreseeable funding promotes the long-term viability. In addition to funding assurances and stability, the new formula simplifies school grants by consolidating the number from 36 to 15. It continues to recognize and utilize program unit funding, ESL and FSL, refugee and First Nations grants. These are the supports that students continue to need and will continue to receive. We are spending over $8 billion a year on K-12 education. Our responsibility as a government is to ensure that those funds are used appropriately to achieve better student outcomes. And this new funding formula will help ensure that happens. And Mr. Speaker, as a father of 2 young daughters, a well-funded education system is important to my family and the families in my constituency.
The honourable member for Cypress Medicine Hat has the call.
Mr. Speaker, the news that Teck withdrew their Frontier Mine application was absolutely devastating news for Albertans and our communities. This decision came on the cusp of what was great news regarding the progress of the project. All 14 proximate First Nations had confirmed their support. However, only mere hours later, the news became irrelevant. The decision made by Teck was unequivocally the direct result of the federal government's complete failure to ensure investor confidence in our nation. And as a result, billions of dollars of investment and thousands of jobs have been lost. And Albertans are once again left to feel alienated and forgotten in their own country. Albertans are sick or tired of this. Does Mr. Trudeau really think that Albertans are just going to stand idly by while opportunity after opportunity pass us due to the incompetency of his government? And instead of calling a spade and denouncing the disastrous actions of the federal government, this NDP blamed our government for the decision after all the progress we had made. They didn't blame Mr. Trudeau and the federal government for undermining investor confidence and our economic interests, or moving the goalposts repeatedly and politicizing a 10-year review process by demanding that Alberta stop our challenge against the carbon tax. They've been silent on the radicals who've been blocking the economic arteries of our nation as well. We also saw they didn't stand up for our best economic interests of our province during their brief tenure. Instead, they blame us, even after we had just secured support for the project from all 14 proximate First Nation communities. Mr. Speaker, no, the blame doesn't fall on our shoulders, and it certainly doesn't fall on the shoulders of Albertans. It falls on those who have repeatedly undermined our economy and degraded our province's way of life. Mr. Speaker, the unfortunate decisions only strengthened our government's pledge to all Albertans. We will continue to support oil and gas sector more now than ever, and we will fight for a fair deal for all Albertans within Canada.
Honourable member for West Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, in West Yellowhead, we are proud Albertans who contribute immensely to our province's success, mainly through agriculture, energy, forestry, tourism, and the public sector. In return for our contributions, we don't ask for much. We want our safety to be a priority for government. We want government to understand the role that it is meant to play. And in that context, we ask that our taxes not get too high and for the taxes we pay to be used responsibly. This has not been the case. Simply put, successive governments have spent beyond their means and neglected to provide the vital services my constituents need. Those governments have chosen to allow the roads in my constituency to deteriorate to unacceptable conditions. Every day I drive through my constituency dodging pothole after pothole to avoid severe damage to my vehicle. Sometimes my constituents are not so lucky. Too often their vehicles are damaged and they are left to pick up the repairs, sometimes to the tune of thousands of dollars. West Yellowhead is a main thoroughfare for travelers from the west to enter our province and for travelers from the east to visit the magnificent splendor of Jasper. These visitors, too, are vulnerable to the condition of our roads. They drive through hoping for a nice weekend of skiing or sightseeing and enter a nightmare of sometimes severe damage to their vehicles. Now, I'm not just talking about back roads. This is Highway 16, Highway 40, and Highway 32. The conditions I'm talking about are potholes many inches wide and deep and several meters long. Mr. Speaker, these potholes are not just big enough to cause severe vehicle damage, they also have the potential to be a serious safety threat. The legacy of irresponsible governance neglecting important infrastructure projects must end. I hope our government will make it a priority to get these desperately needed projects completed in a timely and fiscally responsible manner.
Honourable members, and now for what you've all been waiting for, oral question period. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister of Finance said his government is, quote, on track. And to symbolize his efforts, he dusted off the same old cowboy boots he wore for last fall's budget. But let's get something straight. This government has lost 50,000 full-time jobs since they handed over the $4.7 billion to big corporations. 50,000 jobs, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister, how can you possibly claim you're on track? I'd hate to see what track you're on and what it looks like.
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is, I'm sure, always welcome to go and visit the Minister of Finance at his ranch up north and see how regular rural Albertans work hard and get the job done, as this finance minister is, in continuing on the path towards balance through a responsible fiscal policy that will reduce overall spending by 2.8% while focusing on growing the economy and creating jobs. Unlike the NDP that wants to raise taxes on job creators, that wants to punish Albertans with a carbon tax, and that wants to raise income taxes, we're not going to let them get away with killing jobs again, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's 50,000 job losses and personal income taxes going up. In the last year budget, the government projected Alberta's economy would grow in 2020 by 2.7%. Even at the time, those numbers seemed overly optimistic. They were higher than every single private sector forecast. Since then, most of those forecasts have been downgraded. Does the Premier still believe his unrealistic projections from the last budget? Why was he so wrong?
The Honourable the Premier has the call.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's true that the NDP left this province in a recession, left this government to inherit a recession. That has been confirmed today by the Conference Board of Canada, the leading economic think tank in the country, which said that last year Alberta's economy shrunk by 0.2%, thanks to the NDP's policy that left us with higher taxes, higher debt, and killing jobs. That was irresponsible. Mr. Speaker, happily, the Conference Board, their projection fresh off the printer, projects that this year Alberta's GDP will grow by 2.2%, the second highest growth in the Dominion of Canada.
Wow. The Honourable Member.
50,000 job losses under your government, Mr. Premier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday in this House, the Premier claimed that the banks were predicting Alberta will lead the country in economic growth. However, as the Premier just said, that simply isn't true. Since the last budget, TD, National Bank, RBC, and Scotiabank have all downgraded their growth projections. And not one bank has Alberta leading the country in growth this year. So again, to the Premier, why do you not understand how to read the real numbers, or are you simply trying to cover up your failed economic record?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, once again, the most reputable and independent economic think tank in the country, the Conference Board of Canada, has just published its projections for this year of 2.2% growth, exceeding that of 8 other provinces, Mr. Speaker. And that's after we've had to crawl out of the hole in which the NDP dug this province, Mr. Speaker. But what is their plan? Their plan is, they were against us deleting their carbon tax. Then they didn't like us challenging their friend Justin Trudeau's carbon tax. We scrapped the NDP carbon tax, and we've won against the Trudeau tax, and we will not let the NDP bring back a carbon tax, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Mr. Speaker, Alberta will warm faster than the rest of the planet because of human-caused climate change, causing profound impact on Alberta's economy, our infrastructure, and the health of our citizens. This is the conclusion of a well-researched scientific report put together for this UCP government. What did they do with that report? They buried it. They don't want Albertans to know the risks because that would require them to do something about it. To the Premier, when will you stop the cover-ups and start taking real action?
The Honourable, the Minister of Environment and Parks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, we're very proud of the work that we're doing when it comes to emission reductions in this province, Mr. Speaker. But what I really want to talk about, Mr. Speaker, is that opposition party continues to support Extinction Rebellion when it comes to the conversation, when it comes to emission reductions in this province, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the honourable member from Highwoods, Norwood, has said that they want Extinction Rebellion to be able to present in our classroom, Mr. Speaker. That is an organization who downplayed the Holocaust, Mr. Speaker, calling it an almost normal event, Mr. Speaker. As a father of 3 children in this province, Mr. Speaker, shame on them.
Hear, hear.
Honourable members, a point of order is noted at 1:55. The Honourable member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Let's be clear. The only thing that's at risk of extinction are horses and sundry. They had the report. They refused multiple freedom of information requests.
Honourable member, everyone knows what you were implying in the chamber. You can apologize and withdraw before you continue.
On behalf of the horses and sundry, Mr. Speaker, I apologize and withdraw.
Order. Not on behalf of the horses, sir. On behalf of you.
I apologize and withdraw. They refused multiple freedom of information requests for it, and then they tried to sneak it online by falsifying the date that it was posted. I'm not sure what the minister is afraid of, but I'll tell you what he should be afraid of: extreme high and low temperatures, the serious impacts on our farmers and ranchers, and the high risk of devastating wildfires in our communities. Premier, are you seriously going to ignore this report and ignore the problem?
The Honourable Premier has the call.
Mr. Speaker, my understanding is in this situation, the researcher in question was still to submit data before the full data set could be published. The paper was published on open source data by the Government of Alberta, but that member just did a drive-by smear against the Government House Leader based on a case where this member was completely acquitted, Mr. Speaker, to come up with specious and disproven allegations against an honourable member of this legislature is beneath this place and beneath any member of it.
The honourable member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Mr. Speaker, if they won't believe the scientists, perhaps they'll believe Alberta businesses. The Business Council of Alberta says that today's budget should include, quote, further efforts to address climate change, and that Alberta can become the preferred destination of low-carbon capital investment. They also go on to say that creating a new age of opportunity and prosperity for Albertans is possible, and that this will be every bit as powerful as the last. Tech, the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, the Business Council of Alberta. Premier, who do you need to hear it from before you're willing to take real action?
The Honourable, the Minister of Environment and Parks.
Mr. Speaker, we're proud of the work that we're doing on emission management in this province. We're proud of our industry, who's taking a leading role, has all the way. The first province who worked on emissions in this country is the province of Alberta, Mr. Speaker. That side of the House continues to support anti-oil and gas extremists, activists that are working to block railways, even block ambulances trying to get patients to health care, and they're being supported openly by those members. In fact, those members across the way have stood on the very steps of the seat of the democracy of this province and protested with them to stop our oil and gas industry, Mr. Speaker. Again, through you to them, shame on them.
The honourable member for Edmonton Northwest has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In their rush to hand out more than $4.7 billion to profitable corporations, this government is leaving our post-secondary students in the dust. Only days ago, Mount Royal University reported to their students that their tuition would be rising by 7% in this coming year. Wow. 7% in one single year. to the minister. Can he explain to the students at Mount Royal University how they're supposed to afford such drastic cuts and cost hikes to their tuition?
The Honourable Minister for Advanced Education is rising.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is confused. Perhaps I can help him. There's no $4.7 billion giveaway to corporations. I'm not sure where he's coming up with that. But he wants to talk about Mount Royal and tuition hikes because he wants to deviate from their government's record when it comes to tuition. They implemented a tuition freeze, and they said that doing so would increase enrollment and accessibility. Mr. Speaker, look at the numbers. Enrollment is down from when the freeze began. They should look at the science behind tuition policy and tuition freezes before they make decisions, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
What is clear, Mr. Speaker, is that this government only prioritized their no jobs corporate handout and increased tuition right across this province. There's more. Students at NAIT and SAIT, trades colleges, they'll also receive tuition increases and cuts to instructors and support staff. Is this minister proud of the legacy that he's building for himself, where students are forced to pay more and get less for their education?
Good question. The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, again, just trying to deviate from their failed record when it comes to post-secondary education. Over the last 4 years under their tenure, we saw nothing come out of that ministry, no developments. Mr. Speaker, we are moving forward on a plan to ensure the sustainability of our post-secondary system and at the same time develop a new funding model that will help ensure that our graduates are ready for work when they've completed their post-secondary studies, Mr. Speaker. We have the highest youth unemployment rate in decades, and we are working to fix it, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest has the call.
Mr. Speaker, this is the Minister of Advanced Education. He is responsible for advanced education. I would suggest that he starts doing his job. If he doesn't seem to care about that, and neither does his staff. His press secretary took to Twitter just a few months ago claiming that students actually wanted a tuition increase. Minister, do you stand by this claim today that students at Mount Royal University, NAIT, SAIT, and many other trade colleges actually want to pay hundreds of dollars more in their tuition every year? Where do you come up with this stuff?
The Honourable the Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, talking to students is an important priority of mine. It's something that I do on a very frequent basis, and I'm very proud of our student organizations who have been able to provide some very practical and real feedback to government when it comes to a variety of different policies. Of course, as you know, Mr. Speaker, we're moving to build a new performance-based funding model and have been engaged in extensive discussion with our students and with many other stakeholders to help inform that decision. But again, the members on the opposite side of the aisle, or Extinction Rebellion Light, as I like to call them, are just trying to avoid the circumstance, Mr. Speaker, and just trying to gloss over their record when it comes to support for our energy sector.
Order, order, order. Honourable members. I don't think we need to be ordering other members of the House to sit down and do their job. Every member of this House has the opportunity to rise and speak. The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since last summer, wait times for CT scans and MRIs have exploded because this health minister chose not to renew funding. I repeatedly warned the minister in this House about the crisis in diagnostic wait times that he was causing. He wouldn't listen. So I was relieved to hear news on CBC Radio this past Friday that he is finally starting to draft an action plan. The question is, why did the minister wait so long to act? And will he present his action plan to this House today?
Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is that CT and MRI scan wait times have increased for 5 years. They increased every year under the NDP. They increased every year while Edmonton Glenora was the Minister of Health. It was a shame, Mr. Speaker. They're expecting us to fix in 1 year what they couldn't do in 4. They ignored the problem, and we're not going to ignore the problem. We're going to fix these wait times problems we have in Alberta, make sure that all Albertans have access to MRI and CT scans as quickly as they can, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This minister ignored the problem for a year. We heard the throne speech promise that Albertans wouldn't have to pay out of pocket for medically necessary procedures, but I've got news for this minister. It's already been happening on his watch. Julie Mikulishin needed 2 MRI scans to find and treat a tumor on her brain. Thanks to this minister's negligence, she was told to wait 6 months' time or pay $1,600 out of pocket to have them done privately. Why did this minister force his American-style healthcare model on Julie, a working Alberta mother with 2 children and a tumor on her brain?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, Albertans do not need to pay privately for CT scans to have their cancer diagnosed and treated. The minister or the honourable member knows that. He knows that that is false. That is not how we treat cancer in this province, and it's completely unacceptable. I have directed recently AHS to take steps to address CT weight scans. They've taken action immediately. But Mr. Speaker, throwing money, as the NDP did when they panicked in their 4th year of their mandate, they panicked and they threw money at the problem rather than actually taking the time and sitting down and making the tough decisions to be able to fix this problem. They failed to do it. We're not going to, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Doctors have confirmed that the dollars we invested brought down the wait list and protected patients like Julie. Patients in Edmonton are now waiting up to a year, and family physician Dr. Ernst Schuster said, and I quote, "It can't go on like this because people are going to die." This minister was warned by me, he was warned by doctors, he was warned by patients, he was told by AHS they were increasing because of his lack of continuing funding. He knows he's created a crisis. Will he give Albertans' lives the same priority he gave the $4.7 billion corporate handout, immediately reverse these reckless cuts he made to diagnostic imaging funding, and do it today?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, we cut nothing. We cut nothing. We are continuing to increase our spending in healthcare. We're going to continue to make sure that we are going to address the problem that the NDP refused to deal with when it came to MRI scans. When it came to CT scans, they refused to make the tough decisions. We've developed an action plan to be able to do this. We have the staff, we have the equipment, Mr. Speaker, to be able to meet our clinically recommended wait times, and we're going to do it by making the decisions they refuse to deal with.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Red Deer South has a question.
Mr. Speaker, for years, residents of Central Alberta have been pleading for support of the Red Deer Regional Hospital, and for years, former governments dithered and wasted time and money with half-baked measures. Yesterday, I stood with my colleagues to announce a $100 million investment in our hospital, but there is urgency here. Health outcomes are not improved with planning and replanning. It requires action. To the Minister, what steps are you taking to expedite expansion of the hospital?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member notes, I was thrilled yesterday to stand with Premier to announce this much-needed expansion in Red Deer. The member is absolutely correct, Mr. Speaker. Red Deer and Central Albertans have waited far too long for this. I'm proud that our government has been the first to listen, Mr. Speaker. The capital funding of $100 million is in addition to the fact that we're spending on healthcare the highest ever in the province, in our history in this province, and the highest per capita of all provinces. And Mr. Speaker, this announcement is great news, and thank you to the member for his advocacy. Thank you for the advocacy of the Minister of Education and being able to get us to this point.
The Honourable Member.
Given that the Red Deer Regional Hospital is on average at 108% occupancy rate, and given that apathy and political gains by the former government exasperated wait times, lack of capacity, and of most concern, poor health outcomes for Central Albertans, and given that Central Albertans have waited too long, to the Minister, what timeline can be expected for completion of this expansion to the hospital?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this initial $100 million commitment to Phase 1 is our promise to Red Deer that we'll get it done right, and we'll get it done as soon as possible. The business case for the project has been expedited from typical completion time at 12 months being brought down to 7 months so we can get work as soon as possible. This funding is intended to expedite the work to finalize the project scope. Mr. Speaker, the construction schedule and the operating budget, building health infrastructure provides good jobs for Albertans, Mr. Speaker, and we're committed to getting the front-end work of this project done right so that people of Red Deer and surrounding areas have a hospital that meets their needs.
The honourable member for Red Deer South.
Given that the former government was incompetent when it came to the stewardship of taxpayer dollars, and given that the former government would not hesitate about spending in Calgary and Edmonton to buy votes while ignoring the rest of the province, to the minister, what will you do to ensure that residents of the rest of the province, including Central Alberta, are treated in a fair and equitable manner?
The honourable minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The residents of Red Deer and Central Alberta were ignored by the NDP. That's correct. And that won't be the case for our government, Mr. Speaker. We're listening and we're acting. We're keeping our promise to maintain health care funding while providing a universally accessible, publicly funded health care system. Red Deer Regional Hospital represents an important hub for acute care services in the Central Zone, Mr. Speaker. And we hear members of the NDP heckling because they're upset that we are continuing to maintain a publicly funded, universally accessible system, Mr. Speaker. They're angry that we're going to provide what they couldn't do.
The honourable, the member for Edmonton Highlands North.
1 week ago, I joined our leader and several brave women to stand against this government's attack on women's health care and the plan to eliminate surgical procedures of, quote, limited clinical value. These include breast reduction, tubal ligation, and carpal tunnel surgeries that disproportionately impact women and gender-diverse folks. This plan in the minister's AHS report is wrong, harmful, and it needs to be rejected immediately. So will the Minister of Health stand in this House right now and commit to ending his planned attack on women's health?
Yeah. The honourable, the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, that honourable member knows that is false. It is false. It is false. It is false, Mr. Speaker. They are twisting information in the EY report when we did a performance review of AHS. They have twisted that information, Mr. Speaker, to scare patients, to scare Albertans. It is inappropriate, Mr. Speaker. It's time for them to cut it out and stop scaring patients, Mr. Speaker.
Order. I think it might be helpful if the Minister of Health speaks through the chair. The honourable member for Edmonton Highlands North.
Given that the actual recommendation in black and white calls for the elimination of these procedures and to push them off to private, for-profit surgical clinics, and given the minister accepted that recommendation, asked AHS to implement it, then told Post Media that he's ordering AHS to tell doctors to reduce the number of these procedures, will the minister stop telling doctors how to treat their patients, stop telling women what to do with their bodies, and retract his comments right now?
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to repeat it again. As I've done on social media, as I've done in traditional media, Mr. Speaker, they continue to take a part of a recommendation that quoted a list that was from the National Health Service, that the NDP don't even know the difference between a National Health Service in the United Kingdom and the Alberta Health Service in Alberta. Is embarrassing, Mr. Speaker, that they don't know what the NHS is and that they are continuing to twist that fact and trying to scare Albertans is completely disgusting, Mr. Speaker.
Order, the honourable member.
Given that the minister, given all his actions, clearly doesn't believe that physicians are pursuing the best course of action for the women that they treat, he clearly doesn't believe that women have a right to pursue their own choices about their health, noting that he won't reject these dangerous recommendations, saying that it's not a gender issue. Will the minister at least admit that he maybe doesn't have a clue about women's health care and maybe stop giving media interviews about something he clearly knows nothing about?
Order, the honourable Minister of Health has the call.
Mr. Speaker, again, false. False, Mr. Speaker. It is false. They are continuing to scare patients in Alberta by twisting, by misrepresenting, by misleading. Those procedures, Mr. Speaker, will not be delisted. They will not be defunded. They will not be insured. It's time for the NDP to start telling the truth to the patients of Alberta.
Order, the honourable member for Edmonton West Henday.
After meeting with their lobbyist buddies behind closed doors, this UCP government moved without warning to end the 5% cap on automobile insurance rates last fall. The result, Mr. Speaker, rate hikes of up to 30%. Absolutely shocking. My first question today is very simple. Does this minister actually believe annual increases of 30% on insurance rates is fair? And if not, why won't you end this gravy train and reinstate the cap immediately?
See the Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What the honourable member is failing to disclose to this House is that under the 5% rate cap, Alberta drivers were very negatively affected. They couldn't get a full year. They had to pay a full year's premium up front instead of paying monthly. Many were denied collision and comprehensive coverage, and many were not able to access coverage through their broker as insurance companies severed contracts with the brokers. Mr. Speaker, they are hiding the damage they did to the insurance industry and now trying to make excuses for it after the fact.
Order. The Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday.
Mr. Speaker, all the consequences that were just listed by that minister are happening as a result of them lifting the 5% cap on insurance. Now, given that big profitable corporations get a $4.7 billion handout from this government, while residents like Edmonton senior Don Belanger are forced to come up with $600 more a year just to keep his car on the road, and given that Don joined us at the throne speech this week to send a message to this government that removing the insurance cap is absolutely not okay and his household budget is suffering as a result. To the minister, why won't you listen to Don's message and those of so many others across our province who are seeing their bills rise? Is it because you only have time for donors and party insiders?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, it's interesting they want us to listen to Albertans because that's exactly what we're doing that the NDP government failed to do. We're addressing the issues that they wouldn't address. The fact is, the Automobile Expert Advisory Committee is currently listening to Albertans, collecting evidence and meeting the stakeholders to develop recommendations that will report back to government this spring. If the previous government had the courage to do the right thing, they would have had that conversation when they had the chance.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We continue to see from this government that they take action and consult after the fact. It's very concerning. Now, given that when confronted with the size of insurance hikes, 30% in some cases, the Minister of Finance's press secretary could only suggest that unhappy Albertans should, quote, shop around. To the minister, will you apologize for the comment made by your staffer? And to make amends, I'm asking once again, please do the right thing and reinstate the 5% cap on insurance.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP wants to stick Albertans without being able to get comprehensive insurance, without being able to, with having to pay the whole year's bill at once instead of doing it month by month. The same people that seem to care about people that have a hard time making ends meet we're actually making it harder. We're going to fix what they refuse to fix. Mr. Speaker, we're talking to experts right now, and as I said, we will report this spring.
Member for Spruce Grove, Stony Plain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chiropractors are valuable medical practitioners who provide a wide-ranging number of services to Albertans. They do this despite not having been a publicly funded or insured service since the formation of AHS in 2008. In recent negotiations with AMA, Alberta Health put forward an initiative that involved taking away the right for chiropractors, amongst other uninsured practitioners, to refer patients for diagnostic imaging. Can the Minister of Health explain the reasoning behind this proposed change and whether the review done by Ernst & Young supports making this change?
It's false. Order. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, although it seems that Goldbar is really excited to come jump up and answer the question for me. We're acting, Mr. Speaker, to make insurance coverage consistent across providers and across provinces, but I'd like to note, though, that the scope of practice for these professionals or their ability to order diagnostic imaging services is not going to be affected at all. It only affects who pays for the service, Mr. Speaker. And so I should also clarify that the decision was made by my department, not by AHS. It does align with the McKinnon panel report and the EY review, which both say that changes must be made in order to make sure that our healthcare system is sustainable.
The Honourable Member for Spruce Grove, Stony Plain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for his answer. Given that this change was suggested by Ernst & Young and fulfills a campaign obligation to bring Alberta's government spending back into check, and given that this decision puts Alberta's policies more in line with other provinces, can the Minister please explain what he and his department are doing in order to make sure diagnostic imaging is still available in a timely manner for those who need it?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. CT wait times increased every year under the NDP, and AHS's total cost per CT scan is up to 50% more, or 50% higher than it is in other provinces. Now, I've directed recently AHS to make any changes required to their payments for DI services to find the efficiencies and reinvest the savings in order to increase services. The Alberta Surgical Initiative will require, of course, increases in scans, and those costs will be funded through the savings from the EY review. And we're making changes to bring our costs in line with other provinces, Mr. Speaker. And every dollar we save will stay in the system.
The honourable member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister of Health. Given the scale of this change to our system, including the prospective impacts on access to a professional who can refer diagnostic imaging, should that be required, and given some of the backlash that has come from the opposition, can the Minister please explain what consultation was done prior to proposing this in negotiations, as well as informing all of us what kind of consultation is still ongoing?
The honourable minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. After the McKenna panel report was tabled in August, we notified the AMA that we wanted to begin negotiations in September. We gave them a few months, so in November those negotiations began, and that included consultations on 11 proposed changes, primarily related to a schedule of rates that physicians are able to charge. I've been meeting with physicians since those consultations began. I got great feedback, continue to get great feedback, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to work with the AMA. We'll move forward on a new physician compensation framework, and that new framework will prevent $2 billion, Mr. Speaker, in cost overruns and improve services for patients.
The honourable member for Edmonton Whitemud is risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Airdrie, High River, Fort Saskatchewan, Edmonton, Sturgeon County. These are just some of the communities impacted by the chaos created when the Minister of Children's Services decided to abruptly cancel all parent-linked programs and implement a confusing new process with unclear outcomes. As a result of the uncertainty, some organizations have been forced to lay off staff, some have announced they'll be reducing programs, and some have even announced that they're closing. Why has the minister intentionally created anxiety and job loss to early childhood and parenting programs that these communities rely on?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What our government is undertaking is continuing to implement the Wellbeing and Resiliency Framework that was actually introduced by the members opposite. It is based on brain science, best practice, and I will not continue to do things the way we've always done them because we've always done them that way. We owe it to vulnerable kids and families to strengthen those support services for them.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that local newspapers in Medicine Hat, Ponoka, Rocky Mountain House, Crow's Nest Pass, Wetaskiwin, Rimbey, Stettler, Canmore are all reporting that local programs are absolutely being impacted by this uncertainty and the budget cuts that this minister has created. And given that the Minister of Children's Services has stated that the final decisions on whether funding and programming will even continue will only come 2 weeks before the programs end, why is the minister adding uncertainty and chaos by leaving these critical community organizations and families hanging until the literal last minute?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand that change is difficult, but this is change that is very necessary to ensure that children and families across this province who are in vulnerable situations are getting the supports that they need, that build on their strengths, and that help keep their kids safely at home with their families.
Member.
Thank you. Given that the Sturgeon Community Resource Network, which had been operating for over 20 years, was told they did not meet the requirements for the new model, given that the Western Rocky View Family and Community Resource Centre in Cochrane reported that they will certainly lose out on at least $350,000, resulting in far less services for families and children, and given that centres that have been providing services and supports for decades are closing and anticipating deep service cuts, what does the minister have to say to Alberta families who are left in limbo, wondering about the fate of their programs as a direct result of her reckless decisions?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, these decisions were based on the recommendations from our community partners who told us that this was necessary work to ensure that kids and families are getting the supports they need. What I would ask the member opposite is what we have been doing over the past 2 decades working when the number of kids coming into care, 1.7% of the Alberta population, has not been reduced. We owe it to kids and families across Alberta to do better, to be better, to build on their strengths, and to build up their families, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Edmonton South.
Yesterday, Albertans gathered at the Legislature to call on this government to show support for evidence-based harm reduction initiatives and to stand with those families struggling with addictions and coping with the tragic loss of life. The group had the permission that they needed, but when they arrived, they were told that they needed to take down crosses built to commemorate the lives of those tragically lost to addictions. The Minister of Infrastructure was responsible for this decision. Will he explain to survivors, families, and friends of the opioid crisis how he could be so heartless?
The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's disappointing. Again, this is not a question about government policy, Mr. Speaker, but I am happy to talk about government policy. This government is proud of the work it's doing when it comes to addictions and mental health. We're proud of the Associate Minister of Addictions and Mental Health, Mr. Speaker. As you know from the throne speech that just came into the House this weekend, that we are on our way to bringing in 4,000 new addiction beds, Mr. Speaker. This side of the House is committed to working hard when it comes to addiction management inside this province and to finding real solutions. That's a significant contrast from the former government, who did absolutely nothing to help Albertans.
The honourable member for Edmonton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that apparently it is this government's policy to take down crosses from grieving family members, and that this group's peaceful and moving demonstration was disrupted despite them having permission to hold a rally here, and given that the repeated comments from the Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions show the lack of respect that he has for Albertans and this group, will the Minister of Infrastructure confirm again that this will not happen under his tenure? Or is this how the UCP treats the freedom of speech of assembly for groups they don't agree with?
The Honourable, the Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, our United Conservative Party proudly stand behind all Albertans' charter freedoms to peacefully assemble and freedom of speech, Mr. Speaker. I'll look into the issue and will ensure those things won't repeat again, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable, the member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that after the Assembly that gathered to mourn the loss of thousands of lives, the Associate Minister of Addictions tweeted a statement describing supervised consumption sites as, quote, aiding and abetting criminal activity. And given that after tweeting this cruel statement, he had the audacity to claim that he had heard those who attended and that he respected them, will the Associate Minister stand now in this House and apologize for his thoughtless and callous acts that occurred at this very Legislature yesterday?
The Honourable, the Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Mr. Speaker, instead of apology, I'm so proud standing in this House. Our government support a full continuum care that support people from prevention, intervention, treatment, and recovery. Mr. Speaker, our government committed $140 million and have solely dedicated this ministry to work on mental health and addiction. Mr. Speaker, that previous failed government with a one-pillar approach completely failed our burdens. We're going to be different. We're going to focus on the comprehensive strategy, get the life better for our burdens.
Here. The honourable member for Brooks Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Brooks Medicine Hat in southeastern Alberta is home to a diverse economy and a highly skilled workforce. We are fortunate enough to be home to job creators such as Hut 8 Bitcoin Mining, Aurora Cannabis, CF Industries, Methanex, JBS Meats, Big Marble Farms, and the Red Hat Co-op. Since the industrial heartland north of Edmonton got its designation as such in 1998, over $40 billion in investment has been realized. To the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism, how is such a designation created, and could a potential Southern Alberta industrial zone for my region have a similar effect?
The Honourable, the Minister of Economic Development and Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. The Alberta Industrial Heartland is an association that was a creation of partner municipalities. The 5 municipalities have collectively agreed through usual area structure planning process to designate specific areas of land for industrial purposes. Our government is continuing to work with areas like the Heartland and the Tri-Municipal Partnership in the Peace Region to find ways to enable more efficient regulatory approaches for cluster development. Our government is also introducing an investment and growth strategy which will work to attract investment back to Alberta's key sectors.
The honourable member for Brooks Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the Alberta Sugar Beet Growers is a leader in raw material production for petrochemical feedstock, and given that the NDP's burdensome regulatory and taxation regime led to that company's decision to move their feedstock processing to BC, and given that this caused the loss of $1.2 billion in investment from the Alberta economy, along with an estimated 800 jobs, to the same minister, what is our government doing to attract such jobs and investment back to Alberta?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are working hard to bring investment back to our province after it fell by tens of billions of dollars under the NDP. Between 2014 and 2018, foreign investment in Alberta fell by over a third. It is time for us to reverse that trend, and that is why we are introducing an investment and growth strategy which will focus on key pillars of our economy, including energy, agriculture and tourism, as well as aerospace and aviation, technology and financial services.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for her answer. Given that there is interest by several job creators to expand their operations in my constituency, and given that several businesses in my community are looking to market their products across Canada, and further given that these companies' success would not only lead to diversifying our economy, but also create much-needed jobs, to the same Minister, given this government's commitment to reducing interprovincial trade barriers, how can your ministry assist these companies to create jobs and diversify our economy?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again to the member for her question. It's true that interprovincial trade is a massive barrier to economic growth. Internal barriers to free trade cost Canada's economy between $50 billion and $130 billion every year. Our Premier has shown bold leadership on this file by removing most of Alberta's exceptions under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, taking us from the third most exceptions but to by far the lowest. The Montreal Economic Institute ranked Alberta first on interprovincial trade. We encourage other provinces to follow suit, and we're already seeing encouraging signs.
The member for Edmonton City Centre is rising.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, at last count, there are confirmed cases of novel coronavirus in 44 countries around the world, including China, South Korea, India, Italy, Iran, Brazil, the United States, and many others. More than 80,000 cases worldwide, 11 cases in Canada, though thankfully none to date in Alberta. Federal public officials are warning Canadians, however, to prepare for a pandemic. Can the Health Minister inform this House on what he's doing to prepare for such a possible pandemic?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the honourable member for the question. Both the Ministry and AHS have taken steps to make sure that we have the procedures within our facilities as well throughout the province to make sure that we're going to be protecting healthcare workers if and when somebody does come to Alberta with corona or COVID. And so on top of that as well, we've been taking steps to make sure that we have the materials and the supplies available to us to be able to deal with any situation that might come to Alberta.
Well, member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that Alberta is home to 3 international airports, 6 international land border crossings, and numerous transportation links to other communities across Canada, and given that early coronavirus symptoms can appear to simply be the common cold or the flu, can the minister tell this House what screening or surveillance measures have been put in place to ensure early detection in the event that the virus should arrive in our province?
The Honourable Minister.
It's actually a fantastic question, Mr. Speaker, because it involves working with our federal partners, because a lot of that work has to be done by them with our international airports. The federal government has taken steps, and Dr. Tam, through the I'm sorry, I can't remember the acronym, but the Public Health Advisory Council has taken steps. All of the chief medical officers of health for the provinces, the 3 territories, and the federal government have been working together to make sure that those international airports here in Alberta and throughout the country have taken steps to be able to make sure that there is screening in place, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that the spread of the coronavirus is a continually developing situation, and given that there is understandably somewhat of a concern about the coronavirus amongst my constituents, indeed I think many Albertans and those of all members in this House, will this minister commit to continually updating the public on the coronavirus situation and efforts to prevent it? And will the minister commit to hold briefings specifically for the media and this official opposition as the situation develops?
The Minister.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and I have been trying to do that through social media. If folks can follow me through social media, either Facebook or Twitter, we do have websites dedicated. Alberta.ca/coronavirus, I think, is the website that's available for people to get updates every day. The Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Henshaw, is also continuing to be able to provide briefings to Albertans on the steps that both the Ministry and AHS is doing. AHS also has their own websites to be able to continue to brief Albertans. We have also provided both with ethnic media and with traditional media, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary-McCall has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday in question period, the Minister of Energy suggested that it was consumers who were to blame for the 19% electricity price hikes in Calgary and 20% hikes in Edmonton, rather than her senseless and harmful decision to lift the price cap. This morning, I heard from Bruce, who shared with our caucus that his most recent electricity bill doubled. Will the Minister of Energy acknowledge the hardship that this skyrocketing electricity bills are causing Albertans like Bruce? Does she even care?
The Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned yesterday, there are over 30 providers of contracts, independent contracts, that will allow for electricity rate lower than the rate cap. Those processes are available. With the Consumers Advocate is available to talk to people about that. We've put information out on every single electricity bill. Mr. Speaker, we care about the cost of electricity. They didn't, because they took a lot of steps imposing their ideological processes into the electricity, running up the cost.
Shame.
The honourable member for Calgary-McCall.
Given that another Albertan, Dan, told us that since the price cap was lifted, he's paying 3 times as much despite using less electricity. And given that when asked about these huge increases in electricity prices, the Minister of Energy stated, and I quote, "There is no reason that Albertans have to pay more than 6.8 cents. Is the Minister somehow suggesting Albertans like Bruce and Dan no longer need to heat their home or keep the lights on? Why are you so out of touch with these Albertans?"
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, in the years since it was implemented, the rate cap has cost Alberta taxpayers over $90 million. Wow. If it carried through until 2021, it would cost an additional $283 million. Mr. Speaker, that is taking Alberta's taxpayer money from Albertans and then returning it to Albertans, the same Albertans, as a subsidy on their electricity bill. Mr. Speaker, the solution to this is keeping electricity costs down. The solution to this is to take their ideology out of the electricity system so we can provide Albertans with affordable electricity.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member.
Given that only subsidy that Alberta received was that $4.7 billion to wealthiest corporations, we warned Minister that these massive price spikes would be the result of her lifting the cap in December. And given that at the time the Minister claimed that the decision to end the rate cap was made after she had received overwhelming feedback from consumers, Albertans, and given that neither I or any of my colleagues have heard from any constituent demanding their electricity bill be hiked by 19 to 20%, does the Minister really still stand by her ridiculous claim that consumers actually want to?
The Honourable, the Minister of Energy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, do you know what Albertans see on their electricity bill every single month? It's called the balancing pool adjustment, and it's a charge on each and every bill every single month to pay for the NDP ideological meddling in the electricity industry. It's to pay for the return of the power pool, the PPAs, and it costs the balancing pool now running up to $2.7 billion that Albertans are going to be paying off every single month. Mr. Speaker, that is what's causing electricity to be high.
Hear, hear. The honourable member for Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo has a question.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Minister of Education announced a new K-12 funding model which ensures rural schools are able to deliver programs in an equitable way. Many school boards across the province have expressed optimism about these changes. In Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo, Northland School Division expressed that they were pleased that funding for high schools was changing to a single-base instruction rate. To the Minister of Education, will this new funding model fulfill the commitments we made to Albertans and help support our rural schools?
The Honourable, the Minister of Education has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member for the question, and absolutely this will help support our rural schools to deliver equitable programs. I'm pleased to say that we have honoured our commitment, and I'm very proud to say that the new funding model includes a grant that would help ensure rural schools with declining enrollment are able to deliver programs to their students in an equitable manner. I'm looking forward to sharing more of the details as we bring forward the budget.
Awesome.
The Honourable Member for Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo.
It is given, Mr. Speaker. It's been over 15 years since the K-12 funding model was last updated, and since then, education spending has grown by 80%, substantially outpacing inflation and enrollment growth. The new funding model is supposed to reduce red tape and streamline the grants in the education system. Can the Minister please elaborate on these changes that school boards will see in this upcoming year?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Our new funding model reduces red tape and gives more flexibility to school divisions so that they can determine how to best invest our taxpayer dollars. By simplifying the number of grants to 15 from the current 36, while still maintaining record levels of spending, school authorities will be able to better direct funding to support the unique needs of their students.
Member.
As given, Mr. Speaker, across the province there have been many rural, urban, and metro models that have come out in support of this new funding model. I mean, I appreciate the consultation process provided by the Minister of Education. Can the Minister explain how this model was created and who exactly did she consult with?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Staff from my department met with every single school division and engaged with education system leaders as we developed this new funding model. Collaboration was key in this particular format, and the priority of mine throughout the entire process is to advance the work of this framework because it is so necessary. It's what people wanted.
Honourable Member for Calgary Glenmore.
Mr. Speaker, our natural gas industry faces the same issues accessing world markets that have plagued our province's oil sector, including the spread of misinformation. The U.S. has placed emphasis on energy independence, creating lower demand for Canadian products. Therefore, Alberta must seek out new markets for our natural gas products. Meanwhile, protesters in BC are attempting to block our natural gas from reaching international markets. To the Associate Minister of Natural Gas, what is the government doing to support getting our LNG off the West Coast?
The Associate Minister of Natural Gas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the members opposite had their way, Mr. Speaker, they would still be on this side of the House, side by side with Extinction Rebellion, protesting the Coastal Gas Link. Well, Mr. Speaker, I know two things. One is that it will be 45 years before that Albertans ever forgive the members opposite for the damage that they did to this province, Mr. Speaker. And the second thing is, this administration, we stand beside the energy industry and we stand alongside our Indigenous allies in true reconciliation.
Honourable Member for Calgary Glenmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that communities like those surrounding the industrial heartland rely on the jobs and economic benefits that come from industrial innovation and continued growth from our energy sectors, and given that, that Alberta's low natural gas prices have created an opportunity for natural gas products to add value to industries like the petrochemical sector, to the Associate Minister, what is this government doing to encourage corporations like those in the petrochemical sector to consider Alberta a viable jurisdiction for long-term investment?
The Honourable, the Associate Minister of Natural Gas.
Mr. Speaker, Alberta is home to high-quality, low-cost feedstock. We've got a skilled workforce in place as well. Mr. Speaker, we are a destination, so we are currently having the largest, most robust consultation that has ever happened in this industry, and we're building both a brand and a vision that is going to make this province a destination, not just for natural gas, but for petrochemical as well.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that it can take up to 4 times longer to have a natural gas project approved in Alberta than in Texas, and nearly twice as long in our neighbouring province of Saskatchewan, and given that our province's regulatory red tape creates unnecessary financial burdens on our already struggling natural gas sector, and given that too much industry regulation serves as a proven barrier to investment, To the Associate Minister, how will this government reduce the cost of our regulatory regime and make us competitive with jurisdictions like Texas?
The Associate Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By the end of our first term, we're going to have cheaper taxes, Mr. Speaker, than 44 U.S. states. That's going to make us competitive with Louisiana and Texas. Now, we all know that the tone-deaf decision-making on behalf of the previous administration resulted in billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, Mr. Speaker, fleeing the province. That's a shame. Now, it begs the question, Mr. Speaker, is that the reason why the member for Calgary-McCall has sat in this legislature for 54 days and he has not asked a single natural gas question? That's a shame.
Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Presenting petitions, notices of motions, introduction of bills.
The Honourable, the Government House Leader on behalf of the Minister of Finance.
That is correct, Mr. Speaker. Let's see what we're doing today, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave on behalf of my colleague, the Minister of Finance and President of the Treasury Board, to introduce Bill 4, the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Fixed Budget Period Amendment Act 2020, which is proposing to establish a fixed budget period for the month of February of each year. The fixed budget period aligns with one of the recommendations of the McKinnon panel, Mr. Speaker, and it will help enhance transparency and accountability in government financial reporting.
Honourable members, the Honourable Government House Leader on behalf of the President of Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance has moved first reading of Bill 4, the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Fixed Budget Period Amendment Act 2020. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 4, Fiscal Planning and Transparency Fixed Budget Period Amendment Act 2020 is now read a first time.
The Honourable, the member for Calgary-Fish Creek.
Speaker, I request leave to introduce a bill being the Strategic Aviation Advisory Council Act. Mr. Speaker, this bill is intended to bring together a broadly represented council of aviation and aerospace sector experts from across our province, and to be reflective of the great diversity and diversification opportunities within a growth industry. After 2 decades in the aviation industry myself, I speak from a position of deep understanding of the opportunities that lie ahead and of the importance of our connectivity to the world with respect to the movement of people, goods, and capital. But I am humbled at every turn by the entrepreneurial, pioneering, and innovative spirit that reflects our rich aviation history and proud legacy of leadership in the bright blue skies above our province. From the history of Edmonton's Blatchford Field as the gateway to the north, as early as 1927, to our proud contribution to the victorious outcome in the Second World War of over 130,000 aviators through the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, we have much to celebrate and embrace with respect to past accomplishments and future opportunities for global leadership in aviation and aerospace. Mr. Speaker, I encourage all members of this House to reach out to me to ensure we engage all relevant players across this great province in what I believe can be an exciting, innovation-driving, job-creating, and investment-attracting initiative. And Mr. Speaker, I can assure all members of this House and Albertans that we won't just be winging it as we work hard together to ensure that the Alberta's first-ever Strategic Aviation Advisory Council takes flight. Thank you.
I think we can all agree on one thing. That's probably the best dad joke of the day. Honourable members, the member for Calgary-Fish Creek has moved first reading of Bill 201, Strategic Aviation Advisory Council Act. Does the Assembly agree to the motion for first reading? All in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 201, Strategic Aviation Advisory Council Act is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
Honourable members, is there anyone with a tabling today? I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise to table the requisite number of copies of a CBC document titled New Numbers Confirm Alberta Drivers Facing Higher Auto Insurance Costs.
Are there others? The honourable member for Lac-La-Biche, Cold Lake, St. Paul.
Close enough, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, a new session and a new opportunity to remind the House of the NDP's LEAP manifesto that seeks to shut down our oil and gas industry in this province. From the LEAP manifesto to Extinction Rebellion.
Is there others? Seeing none.
Tablings to the clerk. Deferred divisions.
Honourable members, the point of order from 156, I believe it was, has been withdrawn. Honourable members, we are at orders of the day, orders du jour, but to allow appropriate time to prepare for the budget address by the Honourable, the President of the Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance this afternoon, the House will recess until 3:15.
Order.